So we are moving on to our last content area for this school year. Normally, of course, we would have already gone through 6 and moved on forward, but the AP exam this year will only go through content area 6. So I will always share as much information with you guys as I can with what the 2 FRQ types are going to be exactly like and practicing those things. So you're in good hands. Trust me. I know this is new territory for all of us, but we will figure it out. One of the things that I want to be sure to do is make sure that you guys have plenty of review time. And I know you will, but I'm going to provide you review activities to help you. And I know some of y'all already have some of those. So just know that things will be coming right now. We're going to just go over what I affectionately call the liney page of content area 6. If you don't have the FFCC notes printed out for content area 6, I've shared the doc with you guys. So you can do that, or you can just take notes on good old fashioned notebook paper, or you could just follow along with me. So Africa is going to, it goes really well along with the themes we've been talking about with the Indigenous America. So man in the natural world, rituals, ceremony, power and authority. There's a lot of ancestral ideas. And so there's a lot of continuity with what we've been talking about, and then we'll build off of that. So these are some things we talked about way back in the beginning in content area 1, prehistory. So our first ever work that we learned about when you guys were just art history babies back in the beginning was, what was our first work we looked at? Can anyone tell me? Hopefully you are saying out loud to yourself, the Apollo 11 stones. So we know, and we've already talked about the fact that human life is understood to have begun in Africa and then of course spread over millions of years. So that's something that College Board would want you to have an understanding of. Initially, we talk about rock art as the earliest form of art that we really discuss, not only rock art like the Apollo 11 stones, but also cave paintings like we saw at Lascaux. We know that there has been changes in climate and topography. And so a lot of the areas that we now have as desert used to be grasslands. And so when we looked at some of our prehistory work, when we have talked about changes and man in the natural world, how man can manipulate the natural world or respond to the natural world, those are some things we'll still be talking about with Africa. Now remember, Africa's a continent, so we're talking about a lot of different countries that have had different borders, of course, over time, and then we're talking about a lot of different regions. So we're talking about this huge continent that has all these different aspects, these different people groups. So for the most part, we're going to be staying right along the west, kind of northwest coast of Africa. We'll be working through the Edo people, Benin, Nigeria. We'll go over into the Congo, kind of in the middle, and then we'll go all the way up to Mali. And then we'll look at, I think, one piece down south. So the majority of what we're looking at is going to be on that northwest side of Africa. So it's important to remember that African arts are active. So they are meant to be used. And we talked about this with the Indigenous America, and we talked about how important it was that the life force of an object is activated, right? And so they're active works of art. They're meant to be used. They have an essence to them that is to be used. Some of the things that the artwork we're going to look at, its function. Sometimes it has a ritual function. It's to be used in a certain ceremony. It's to be used at a certain time of year. Whereas sometimes it's for storytelling, or sometimes it becomes an object of power. So they can, we'll also actually see art objects that are made to monitor humanity and how human beings are acting, how they're behaving. So morality will be part of that as well. So there's a lot of different functions, motivating behavior, showing belief systems, which is something we'll talk about as well, ancestral beliefs also, to validate social organization. So thinking about social order, and then how humans relate to each other, which can bleed into rituals, right? Not everything we look at will not all be objects. We will see a lot of objects, but we're also going to see the performance that is attached to that object. And so that's going to be important as well. Belief systems will be something we have already talked a lot about, even in Western art, but we'll also talk about that here. Man in the natural world, but not representational necessarily. So a lot of the art we look at that is from the African cultures has to do with maybe what we would call like an abstraction or a stylized view of the natural world, not just a literal depiction of the natural world. Now remember, if realism is not your goal, we're definitely not going to be judging art. We're not going to be saying that's better, that's worse. We're going to be really, really careful with that word primitive, because we want to make sure that we're looking at something within its own context. And then lastly, African art is oftentimes meant to be presented, sung, danced, performed. It has some sort of presentation or ceremonial aspect to it. All right, so this again reinforces that idea that African art is active. A lot of what we'll see is a figure or a mask, a talisman, something like that. The main themes we're going to see: power and authority, beliefs, practices, connections within community, setting up of social hierarchy. African art oftentimes marks status and identity. We saw that I think, you know, about like the Incan art, right? Art that's going to show different social classes set apart. One of the things we see, I think about the Pyxis that we looked at of the Islamic Pyxis, and it had the carved Umayyad iconography on it. And we talked about how that legitimized the prince who owned it, right? It was a coming of age present. And so we'll see some of that with African art, objects or rituals that are associated with coming of age. And then a lot of the time, those coming of age objects will also legitimize the owner of the object. So they'll be personalized for a specific individual, specific leader. Not unlike what we saw with Augustus Suprema Porta, George Washington, things that legitimize the leader. Now, as I mentioned before, something we'll talk about a lot is, unfortunately, people who are outside of these African cultures have negatively addressed, characterized, labeled things as primitive and with a negative connotation, or have seen them as animalistic when, you know, maybe they're not, or give them this this really like degrading characterization. So we're going to be really careful with that, making sure not to do that. These are rich histories that are every bit as important as every other culture we talk about. So we'll be very specific with that. Now, a lot of times when African art is collected, what ends up happening is, and the same thing happens with a lot of indigenous work, not Maria Martinez, the Black on Black, but a lot of other indigenous work is, it's not signed. Well, signing works of art is really a Western idea, right? And so you can't penalize another culture for not having that emphasis on the individual making a mark of their name. And so just because a work is not signed by an artist does not mean that it's not art, of course. And it definitely doesn't mean that the maker was not important. It just means they don't have that tradition of signing in the lower right corner, right? And so don't think it doesn't matter who made it. These objects are still very important and very valued as individual creations. We just don't have that legacy. And some of the times the artist might have signed it and that documentation wasn't included with the work because the collector didn't consider it important. So just keep those things in mind. And then of course, we know that there's going to be a lot of converging culture. So influence coming from Africa, specifically West Africa, to the Western world. Some of that happens through trade. expeditions, other things like that. All right, so we'll stop there for our Africa intro. Figure out how to stop.